actually two ways that a neuron can fire. Sometimes one stimulation will be enough. Usually it's not. Usually it either takes a number of stimulations over a large space, or it takes a number of stimulations over time. If it has to do with space, if it has to do with you've got dendrites and they're connected to a whole bunch of other neurons. If it takes space, they refer to it as spatial summation, where it can only fire because of the activation in the around the space. If it has to do with time, which is really kind of interesting, if it takes time, sometimes these things will add up, and then it will be stimulated. If you think of pain, how much, usually it has to do with spatial summation. There's something, thank you very much.
Thank you.
If you think about pain, usually it has to do with spatial summation. If you stick somebody with a needle, a lot of times they can't feel it at all because there's not enough stimulation over a wide space. But sometimes after a while, you'll start to get pain. You'll start to get an aching pain. Usually, it has to do with the amount of stimulation you have over time. So you have the spatial summation and the temporal summation. There you go. I have no idea why that picture is supposed to represent temporal summation, but let's pretend it does. Since a threshold has to be achieved before a neuron will be stimulated, there are various structural factors that can increase the likelihood that a neuron will be stimulated. The number of dendrites receiving stimulation increases, the probability of the threshold, of course, will be reached. So the more stimulation it's getting, of course, obviously, the more likely it's going to fire. If a glial cell overlaps a synaptic terminal, it may increase the amount of neurotransmitter in the cleft by not allowing leakage, and because of that increased amount of neurotransmitter, the neuron may fire. And these are all factors in stimulation. Okay, so we were talking about before, the reason the neuron fires is because sodium channels open up. It recovers because potassium channels open up. Those are both heavy metals, as it turns out. Sodium and potassium are both metals. But if you add chloride to it, they both become salts. And so most salts have a metal in it, and they have a heavy metal in it. Sodium chloride, of course, is common table salt. In the old days, they were thinking that they would make salt out of potassium chloride. But then they realized that people were getting too much potassium in their diets, and they decided. And since sodium chloride is far more common than potassium chloride, they also thought that they might use lithium chloride. Lithium is the substance that we treat bipolar disorder with. So they were thinking they'd use lithium chloride, and they might make salt out of lithium chloride, but then they realized, wait a minute, this is a heavy metal, whereas potassium and sodium occur naturally in the environment. We have the ability to get rid of that, but lithium, on the other hand, we don't. Lithium will accumulate in your system and potentially can cause a toxic reaction.
I have a question.
I'm sorry?
I have a question.
Sure.
What happens when someone has low potassium?
They have low potassium.
Like 7%.
Low potassium, 7%. We usually give potassium levels in milliequivalents per liter. Most potassiums are between, normal is somewhere between 3 to 5 milliequivalents per liter. Equivalents per liter. 3 to 5. So 7% doesn't really mean anything. If they had a 7, that would mean they'd have too much potassium, and that's not good.
Really?
So, and it's not hard to keep your potassium at a normal level. People that exercise a lot of times especially bike riders, if you will watch the Tour de France, you see these guys eating bananas all the time. Well, bananas are about the best source of, well, you're eating one right there, or you've got one right there. There you go. They're about the best source of potassium you can get. But we get it in all of our foods, almost all of our foods. But if you exercise a lot, you burn off, you'll lose a lot of sodium, of course, sodium chloride, you lose a lot of salt. But at the same time, recovery takes potassium. So you need to maintain 3 to 5 milliequivalents per liter of potassium. Not exactly sure what 7% means. If you have a low potassium, you can take potassium pills. The easiest way to do it is just eat a banana. But there are a lot of other foods with potassium in it.
And that's normal, 3 to 5?
Yeah, 3 to 5. It's 3 to 5. Usually, if you see a potassium that's 4.3 or 4.7, that's usually where almost everybody's potassium is, right around 4. But if it was at 3, they would think, oh, this guy needs to eat more bananas. They need to exercise less. They need to make sure they are taking in enough salt so that they're not depleting their potassium stores. But I mean, most people don't eat so many bananas that they have. It's very rare to see somebody with a really high potassium. It usually means they've got some kind of imbalance taking place. Because the body doesn't normally, it won't accumulate that. You just get rid of it. Just like salt. How do you get rid of your salt? Well, your kidneys clean it out and it washes out in your urine. So we've got sodium, we've got potassium, and we've got chloride. One of the other chemicals that we really need is calcium, Ca2. Why is it Ca2? It's Ca2 because it has twice as many ions as most things. So potassium has 1, sodium has 2, calcium has 2. So, and it's a metal as well. Calcium is a metal. So it's calcium chloride, calcium this, calcium that. Sodium chloride, sodium this, sodium that. That means it's a metal. If it comes first, it's a metal. A chemical synapse works in the following manner. The electrical charge travels down the axon to the axon terminal, and as the electrical charge is moving, of course, we are opening sodium channels, and we are recovering by opening potassium channels. So we've got sodium, potassium, and you need an equal amount of both of those. When I was in the military, one of the things they would give us, we did basic training down in San Antonio, Texas. And it's really hot in the summertime. We got there in October, I think. Yeah, we got there in October. It's still hot. And it was hot until just before we left. But it was hot every day. We sweat a lot, especially the kids from the north. We sweat a lot, so they kept feeding us salt pills so that we wouldn't have any problems. And a couple people actually did. They collapsed when we were running, or they collapsed when we were marching because they had lost so much sodium. They had lost so much salt. The charge changes the permeability of the calcium channels, allowing calcium to enter the synaptic terminal. So we've got sodium and potassium working, and the electrical charge is moving down the axon. When it gets down to the axon terminal, what it does, it changes the permeability of the calcium channels. And so now the calcium is opening up. And since the calcium channels are opening up, now all of a sudden we have a reaction. The synaptic vesicles open up, and the synaptic vesicles will release the neurotransmitter, and that's what needs to happen. So you're dealing with 4 chemicals. You're dealing with sodium, potassium, chloride, of course, and also calcium. And it's the calcium that opens up the synaptic vesicles, releasing the neurotransmitter. And now it can stimulate something else because it's releasing whatever neurotransmitter it's supposed to release. Okay,
It opens up the what?
synaptic
Oh, okay.
synaptic vesicles.
Okay.
So it changes the permeability of the calcium channels, and the calcium channels, of course, are what open up the synaptic vesicles. Because of this, we need to maintain a select amount of these four chemicals: sodium, potassium, chloride, and calcium. Very important. These are known as the electrolytes. And this is what you need to, this is why you drink water, this is why you drink Gatorade, this is why you eat a banana to replace your potassium. In order to function, in order to exercise over an extended period of time, you need to maintain your electrolytes. And this is extremely important. A lot of people don't even think about their electrolytes. When you get thirsty, the reason you get thirsty is because you've depleted some of your electrolytes. You've increased the amount of salt in your system, so you get thirsty to replace some of the H2O that you need. You need to replace all of these things. You need to stay hydrated, and you need to make sure that your electrolytes are in balance. Now, normally we don't have to worry about this because we don't exercise for a very long period of time. We're not going outside and working all day. But if you've ever worked all day in the hot, hot sun, one of the things you probably did was drink a lot of water and not urinate. Because it's the kidney's job to maintain your electrolytes. So if you're sweating a lot, then your kidneys will start retaining electrolytes. So you're replacing your water, you're rehydrating, which is something you have to do, but you're also increasing the amount of sodium and chloride in your system. And because of that, that's what makes you thirsty. But at the same time, your urine will become more and more concentrated, and potentially you won't urinate at all. This is how the body can maintain itself in a really toxic environment, such as out in the desert, when you're walking along out in the desert. And of course, we've all seen those movies where somebody has to walk across some huge expanse of very hot desert, and of course, you never see anybody urinate in the movies anyway, but I don't think you do. I can't remember.
I'm getting thirsty now.
Yeah. And that's a trick. It's a trick that some people use. This is what you're taught in the military. If you're out in a situation like, is there something wrong with it? It's old, huh?
I don't know. That didn't smell good.
If you're out in the desert, what they tell you to do is they don't tell you to drink your urine because it'll be concentrated. It'll be pure sodium chloride. I mean, it'll be really, really salty. You're not supposed to drink your urine, but at the same time, don't urinate because you need that fluid. That's one of the things that they will teach you. So the calcium is one of the electrolytes, along with magnesium. But magnesium doesn't have anything to do with neuronal structures. After the release of the neurotransmitter into the synaptic cleft, the chemical migrates to the receiving neuron and attaches to a transmitter receptor that either inhibits the potential of the receiving neuron or stimulates the neuron to reach its threshold and fire. Much more neurotransmitter is released in the synaptic cleft than can be or will be used, and this is to make sure that the next neuron will fire or that it will be inhibited. So there's a lot more neurotransmitter put into the synaptic cleft than will be needed. Otherwise, there may not be enough, and then the neuron won't fire. So it puts more neurotransmitter in the synaptic cleft than is actually needed. Getting rid of excess neurotransmitter takes, there are two ways to get rid of excess neurotransmitter. One is by chemically breaking down the neurotransmitter and changing its chemical structure so that it doesn't stimulate the neuron. That's one way to do it. And the other way is to just take it back up into the releasing neuron. So a good example of breaking down a neurotransmitter is acetylcholinesterase, which is an enzyme. If you have too much acetylcholine, if you have more acetylcholine in the synaptic cleft than you need to break it down and make it non-toxic again, the synaptic cleft. So the body will send acetylcholinesterase in there, and it will break down the acetylcholine. If you have too much acetylcholine in the synaptic cleft, you may get a neuronal spasm, in which case it just keeps firing. And of course you don't want that to happen, because acetylcholine does a lot of different things. One of the things that it does, it allows you to move. It allows you to have normal movement. And you certainly don't want, you're riding along and all of a sudden you can't control your pencil. Yeah, you can't control things. And that wouldn't be good at all. So you need to break down that acetylcholine. So the first way to do it is to, the first way to do it is to break it down with a chemical, with an enzyme that breaks down the neurotransmitter. And acetylcholinesterase is a good example. The second way to do it is to take it back up. And when they take it back up into the neuron, they call it reuptake. So a good example of that would be serotonin, Prozac. Prozac is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And the reason serotonin works, the reason serotonin puts more serotonin into the synaptic cleft is because it selectively selects serotonin reuptake and it inhibits it. And that's why Prozac works. Prozac works because instead of it taking it back up into the neuron, it allows it to stay in the synaptic cleft. Now, serotonin does a lot of different things. One of the things that it does, it inhibits your sex drive, but that's not the reason that people take serotonin to control to take Prozac to control their sex drive. The reason they take it is to make themselves less depressed than they were before. And if you release serotonin into your synaptic cleft and don't take it back up, one of the things that will happen is that you won't be as depressed as you were before. And everything else in your life is exactly the same. The only difference is now you're not reacting to it the way you were before, by being depressed. So when they first developed Prozac, they got it on the market, and everybody's going, wow, this is great. And the people that who makes, is it Eli Lilly makes Prozac? The guys at the pharmaceutical company are going, 90% of the time this stuff really works. And then they realized, oh geez, look at all these problems that we're having, other than depression. You know, people have all kinds of interesting problems. Well, it wasn't doing anything for those problems. It wasn't decreasing your anxiety. It was allowing you to be less inhibited than you were before. So people were committing suicide, especially teenagers were committing suicide with Prozac. So then they said it's about 75% effective. Further studies said about 75%. Well, it's been on the market for about 35 years. And now they're saying, yeah, about 50% of the time. It works 50% of the time. You're going to have some other effect. And there's a lot of different reasons for this out there. One of them has to do with all the stimulation that we get on a daily basis. If you look at the internet, there's just tons and tons of stimulation. Anyway, so this is acetylcholinesterase. It breaks it down. It breaks down the acetylcholine. It breaks down the acetylcholinesterase. Breaks down the acetylcholine, and it changes its chemical structure so it doesn't affect the other neuron. And the other is reuptake, where it takes it back into the neuron. That just talks about the same thing I was just talking about. Okay. The neurotransmitter binds to a receptor molecule on the receiving neuron. All of this has to do with drugs, okay? This has to do with illegal drugs. It also has to do with legal pharmaceuticals. The neurotransmitter will bind to a receptor site, a specific receptor site. for example, let's take an opiate. You need to control your pain. Well, we have a natural pain controlling mechanism in our own bodies. It has to do with endorphins. So one of the things that needs to happen is that for the opiates to work, they need to bind to the endorphin receptor site. And if it does that, then it will stop the pain from occurring. So that makes sense? That's why it works, because the opiate attaches to the endorphin receptor site. The endorphin receptor site takes the pain away. That's why opiates work. Each neurotransmitter or ligand has different receptor molecules that bind to what is called a ligand binding site. So each neurotransmitter, serotonin, endorphins, dynorphins, enkephalins, those are all the pain controlling mechanisms that we have in our bodies. We have 3 of them that we know of right now. And almost everybody has lots and lots of endorphins, except for the people that aren't sensitive to opiates. And that's me. I'm not sensitive to opiates. They don't work on me. This is the doctor's office. But I don't care. I don't care. It just doesn't work. I have a sister that was hypersensitive to opiates. So every time she took them, she vomited. So maybe she wasn't really sensitive to it either.
Are opiates common in most drugs?
Opiates?
Yeah.
No, it's only, as a matter of fact, it's a narcotic, so they have to tell you if there's any opiates in there. They used to give you Darvon. Darvon is acetylcholine with a kick of Demerol in it. So, yeah, they have to tell you.
Yeah, so I was asking because usually when I go for a dent or something, they pump me full of
Novocaine.
Yeah, if the shakers keep pumping it in because can you feel it? And it's like, yeah, I can feel it.
You have the same problem. I have the same problem. Novocaine doesn't work on me as well as it does on everybody else.
So they say, well, just bite down and hold on to something tight for a couple of seconds.
Yeah, see if it works. It's weird, the last time I went in, he shot me 3 times. He had to hit me 3 times. And it hurts. Because, I mean, the pain, it's not taking the pain away. So everything hurts. And usually I just go, you know, you've already hit me 3 times and it's still not working. Go ahead and I'll grit my teeth. Of course, you know, that's not always good. You shouldn't be in pain. Oh, sad. When excitatory ligands are bound to the receptor molecule, it opens up the sodium channel, and then the receptor molecule allows the sodium to enter the neuron. And if the sodium enters the neuron, of course, it fires. So if it's excitatory, it opens up sodium channels. Okay, we're going to talk about inhibiting neurotransmitters. If enough receptor molecules are stimulated by an excitatory ligand, the neuron's threshold will be reached, and of course the neuron will respond with an electrical charge. However, if it's an inhibitory ligand, one of the things that it does is open up the chloride channels. And so it makes it more negative than positive. And because of that, it takes more of a charge. It takes more stimulation to excite the neuron because it has more negative charge. Does all that make sense? So inhibitory, it opens up chloride channels, making it more negative. And excitatory, it opens up sodium channels, making it more positive, making it more likely that it will fire. So if it's an excitatory neurotransmitter, it opens up sodium channels. And if it's inhibitory, it opens up chloride channels. Neurotransmitters are chemicals, and since they're chemicals, we can duplicate them, we can change the structure of them, we can create pharmaceuticals that will act either to block them or to act just like them. While each receptor molecule binds exclusively to their neurotransmitter, there are similar chemicals that are structurally similar to the neurotransmitter that can bind to the receptor molecule as well. When we talk about methamphetamines, methamphetamines act like adrenaline. So they bind to the same receptor sites. Now we got a really serious problem. Yeah. Because if you take methamphetamines, you get real excited, just like you do when your adrenaline is functioning. Okay, I know this is kind of weird. Acetylcholine is an excitatory neurotransmitter, but the poisons curare. If you've ever heard of curare, the natives in the Amazon River Valley use curare, and what they'll do is they'll see a monkey that they want to eat, and they'll shoot it with a dart, and on the dart will be curare, and the monkey, as soon as it hits it, of course, it gets all bothered and it runs away, but then pretty soon it falls out of the tree. And the reason it falls out of the tree is because curare, as an excitatory neurotransmitter, or it acts as an excitatory neurotransmitter, and the animal will spasm, and it will become paralyzed. And then it falls out of the tree. And then they eat it. Well, not right away, of course. Anyway, so that's curare. It's a South American plant. Bungarotoxin from the bungara snake of Taiwan. It binds to the receptor molecule, causing paralysis. Both of these cause paralysis. Acetylcholine receptor molecules are also targets in the case of poison muscarine from the Amanita muscaria mushroom. This is what that mushroom looks like. I don't know, you've probably never seen one of these guys. It's fairly common in South America and in Europe, oddly enough. Muscarine, however, binds to the receptor molecule and mimics acetylcholine, causing the neuron to fire, resulting in spasms to seizures to death. So if you eat this mushroom, you die. And you die, it's not a very pretty sight. I've seen people who got the wrong mushrooms. You know, magic mushroom, some of them look just like this. So, you know, if you're not real bright, sometimes you use the wrong mushrooms. And watching these people die is not a whole lot of fun. And sadly, there's not a whole lot you can do about it once the whole process takes place. Chemicals that mimic neurotransmitters and cause a similar reaction are known as agonists. Chemicals that mimic neurotransmitters and block the action of the neurotransmitter are called antagonists. And this, of course, is the way that we treat people. We treat you with toxins. We treat you with poisons. If it's not a poison, if it's not a toxin, then of course it wouldn't work. So almost all the medications that people take, whether it's aspirin or whether it's a blood pressure medicine, almost all of these things are toxins. Unless it's an agonist. I was talking to somebody that has diabetes yesterday. And he takes insulin. Of course, he takes synthetic insulin in order to maintain himself, because his insulin doesn't work in his own body. His body is producing it, but there's not enough. I'm not sure whether, I think he has type 2 diabetes. The acetylcholine molecule receptors are referred to as cholinergic. Acetylcholine has at least 4 functions and binds to at least 4 cholinergic receptors. Acetylcholine is extremely important. This is really important. It allows us to move. It acts on, it's an excitatory neurotransmitter in the neuromuscular system. So it's really, really important. It allows us to move. It also acts on the vagus nerve and the heart muscle as an inhibitory neurotransmitter, slowing your heart rate down. Otherwise, your heart rate would go up and we wouldn't be able to control it. But it acts on the vagus nerve and it slows things down. Acetylcholine is used by the brain and the transfer of memory from short-term to long-term memory. If it didn't do this, of course, we wouldn't be able to remember anything. But it's extremely important that we remember things. We need to remember where food is. We need to remember how to drive the car. It would be horrible if we jumped in the car and had to be reminded how to drive a car, especially a manual transmission vehicle where you have to accelerate and pull back on the clutch at a certain rate. It would be terrible if you couldn't remember that kind of stuff. It acts as an inhibitory neurotransmitter inducing you to go to sleep. So it puts you to sleep, allows you to move, has to do with memory, and it slows down your heart rate. Acetylcholine is extremely important. Acetylcholine shares, now you can understand why acetylcholinesterase is so important. Acetylcholinesterase needs to go into the synaptic cleft in order to break the acetylcholine down. You certainly wouldn't want, your muscles would just spasm if you couldn't control it. And of course, we have seen this in a situation where the individual has exercised to an excessive degree, and sometimes their muscles will stop working. And the reason it stopped working, well, one of the reasons it stopped working is because the acetylcholine system isn't functioning. They don't have, usually it has to do with the depletion of sodium and potassium. But you can imagine how destructive it could potentially be if you didn't have enough acetylcholine, or if you had too much acetylcholine and you couldn't get your heart rate up. Your whole fight or flee response would completely break down. So all of these things are really important. You know, you'd go to sleep and never wake up, that kind of stuff. Acetylcholine shares some of the receptor sites with other chemicals, and for this reason the receptor sites are named after the alternate chemicals. Now, most of the alternate chemicals we're going to talk about don't have anything to do with movement. It has to do with some of the toxic substances you put in your body. One of them is nicotine. There is a nicotinic receptor site that works with acetylcholine. So people that smoke cigarettes, one of the things that they do, then cigarettes will stimulate them to function better. In the old days, baseball players used to chew tobacco. And the reason they chewed tobacco was to get a constant amount of nicotine in their system, and then they would react more positively to what was going on in the field. So they used to chew tobacco. Other pitchers used to smoke cigarettes in between innings while their team was up to bat. They would smoke cigarettes. And that was to put nicotine into the system so that the acetylcholine, their functioning would be at an optimum level. Some of these individuals would only chew tobacco on the field. They would only smoke cigarettes at the ballpark. They didn't smoke normally. They didn't smoke all the time. Because that would take the edge off. And it wouldn't, they'd lose their ability to function at a peak performance. One example of the acetylcholine, of course, is the nicotine binds to the acetylcholine receptor site in the skeletal system. And for that reason, these sites are referred to as nicotinic cholinergic receptors. And it's mostly in the neuromuscular system. Muscarine cholinergic receptors also exist in the autonomic nervous system because muscarine kills by stopping the heart and paralyzing the intestines. So muscarine, they call these muscarine cholinergic receptors. It has to do with the vagus nerve and the heart. That's how muscarine kills. There are two types of molecule receptors. We talked about this in the last chapter. Ionotropic means ion moving. Receptors open ion channels and allows them to pass through. Ionotropic is very rapid. It's a very rapid receptor site. Metabotropic, on the other hand, are slow. Metabotropic means change moving. It activates molecules known as G proteins, and this is a relatively slow process as compared to the ionotropic. Ionotropic is very rapid, and metabotropic is slow. So sometimes if you take a medication, they'll tell you, you take a medication, what's a good example of a medication that works with an ionotropic reaction? The stuff you put under your nitroglycerin. You put nitroglycerin pills underneath your tongue, and it works very rapidly. And it dissipates after about 10 minutes. So, and the reason you do that is to take the pain away from a heart attack. Usually people with who have angina, they'll use nitroglycerin to take the pain away. And sometimes if the pain goes away, if you don't take the pain away, then your muscles will stay tight and you won't be able to control the pain. But if you can take the pain away for 5 or 10 minutes, then sometimes the muscles won't react like they did before. Okay, and that's ionotropic.
So what if this is an example? How about the placebo effect, like if you the sugar pills?
Oh, sure, yeah, that works because you think it's going to work. So you get the pain goes away because of endorphins. You're thinking, oh, it's going to go away. So your brain is going, yeah, it's going to go away. So it starts pumping endorphins into your system, and the pain does go away. So it really does work. I mean, that's a lot of things work that way. We can actually control ourselves potentially, and we don't need drugs.
We don't need medication.
Yeah, if we can convince ourselves that it's going to work, but can you do that? I mean, that's, you guys go to ceremonies and the ceremonies work. Wait a minute, what has happened? Is it really this spiritual magic that theoretically is taking place? And the answer is no, yes.
Something positive.
It's positive thoughts. You've created positive thoughts, so. But I mean, everything works the same way. Voodoo works the same way. I mean, everything works the same way. Prayer, why does prayer work? Well, it gives you more of a positive attitude. Now you're less stiff than you were before. You think it's going to work, so it does work. The placebo effect. So, I hate to destroy religion for you. That's not what I'm trying to do. G protein binds to the amino acid guanine in many combinations. These guanine compounds may themselves open up an ion channel or be part of a chain of reactions that open up the ion channel. As you can see, this is a relatively slow process. So it binds to the G protein binds to guanine, and the guanine may or may not. After a while, it might start working. So sometimes you take a medication and you'll tell them, you have to tell people, well, this won't start working right away. It's going to take 20 or 30 minutes for it to work. And mostly it's because it has to be digested, for one thing. But then it's also a metabotropic reaction. And it's going to be a relatively slow process. But it's a longer lasting process because it just keeps binding on the G protein. The G protein binds to the guanine creates the chain reaction, and now it works. And it works over time. And so this is one of the reasons why pharmaceuticals can work over time. They will have time-released substances in there, the gelatin in there. It's time-released. So, and some of them are thicker than others, and the really thick ones won't dissolve until 6 hours down the road. So you get an extended release of metabotropic reaction. There are 4 types of neuronal circuits. We really won't talk about neuronal circuits anymore. This is the only time. There are neural chains, positive feedback circuits, negative feedback circuits, and oscillator circuits. Well, actually, we will refer to this a couple times. The neural circuit is just a straight circuit. It's just this happens and it affects this. It's very rapid. It's relatively simple. The neural circuit, the neural chain. One thing trips another, and then you get the reaction. In a positive feedback circuit, the effect is an increase. It increases in activity or keeps it going. A positive feedback. Negative feedback, it stops the activity. Stops it completely. And then an oscillator circuit, the circuit serves as both a positive feedback circuit and a negative feedback circuit, depending on the circumstances, and usually depending on neurotransmitter. This is the last time we'll talk about that stuff. We'll talk about positive feedback circuits and negative feedback circuits, but other than that, we're not really going to talk about it very much. Sensory neurons will collect data, converts the input through a single neuron, and then diverts the signal when it arrives at the brain. So a good example is the eye. You've got your receptors in the eye. You've got 100 million cones in your eye, and you have 1 million rods and cones. Okay, yeah, you got 1 million rods.
Rods.
Or did I get it backwards? You have 100 million cones in your eye, 1 million rods. The rods, that's backwards. You have 1 million cones and 100 million rods. The rods see black and white, and the cones see color, right? Okay. So you've got 101 million receptors in your eye. So when you look at something, you're getting 101 million pictures in each of your eyes. So that's 202 million if you're using both eyes. You have 202 million pieces of information going into 2 optic nerves. It's feeding into an optic nerve at the back of the eye, and then when it gets into the brain, it crosses and it goes back to the occipital lobe in the back of your brain. And the back of your brain has to take these 202 million pictures that it's getting, and it's got to create a single picture. And it does this in a nanosecond. Okay. But you're getting, if we could isolate each receptor, you would be seeing one tiny little patch of nothing. You wouldn't be able to identify it. It's not like each receptor is getting all the picture, because each receptor is just taking one little piece of information and it's shooting it back to the back of your brain, and now it's creating a picture. So what you're seeing is 202 million pictures. Yeah, all put together. These are all little pixels of pieces of information. I know, it's exciting, isn't it? And sometimes if you move your eyes fast enough, you really can't identify what it is that you're looking at. Your brain starts to, it doesn't have enough information. So you have to look at it over time in order to get a complete picture. The electricity goes off and probably does every place on the res. Anyway, the electricity goes off, and I've got a clock on my oven. And sometimes if I look at that clock, it's shining a number. And if I look away right away, I don't realize that it's actually flashing on and off, because all I see it is flashing on. I don't see it flashing off. So I think it's whatever time. I mean, it was off for what, 4 minutes this morning? Or last night sometime?
Around midnight. For a couple seconds.
Isn't that weird? Anyway, so it lost like 4 minutes or something. So I had to change it this morning, but I didn't realize it had gone off because I just kind of winked at it, and when I winked at it, the light was on, so I just assumed that it was it hadn't been off, as odd as that may seem. Anyway, the electroencephalogram is a device that reads the electrical impulses put off by the neuronal activity in the brain. Electroencephalograms are used to map brain functioning and can be used for sleep analysis or to monitor abnormal seizure activity. We can find seizures. We can also find sleep apnea, where the individual stops breathing. We can see that in EEG, because EEG will fire.
So how does that really happen, like when someone stops breathing?
Usually it has to do with the position that they're in. Sometimes it has to do with if they're overweight. They'll accumulate fat in their neck, and it's easy for them to pinch off their airway. And since they're doing this, your body doesn't really want you to not have oxygen. Your body will wake you up to some extent, but I mean we do this to ourselves all the time at night. If you roll over on your face while you're asleep, you'll start breathing carbon dioxide, and there's a carbon dioxide detector in your brain that will tell you you're not getting enough oxygen, you need to move, and then you'll move. Yeah. People that snore a lot of times it has to do with the position that they're sleeping in. Sometimes you can jiggle that person and they'll roll over and stop snoring. They're not actually getting as much oxygen as their body wants. Your breathing becomes shallower when you're asleep. You really don't need as much oxygen as you do when you're awake. But your body metabolism is taking place. As a matter of fact, the vast majority of your metabolism takes place while you're asleep. Since you're not moving around, you're not doing anything, you're relatively sedentary, your body can replace other cells. It can replace cells, it can repair things, it can replace things. And that's what it takes place while you're asleep. But if you keep waking up, if you keep shooting yourself back up to REM sleep, which is what happens when you have sleep apnea. Every time your apnea takes place, your body starts to wake up. Usually never makes it, and this is the reason that people with sleep apnea don't realize they have sleep apnea. The problem is that their sleep pattern doesn't get enough delta wave sleep, deep sleep, and so they start to degenerate because they're not getting, their metabolism isn't complete. So they're not repairing properly, they're not replacing properly. So you start seeing them aging really fast. And it's because their body's not correcting itself.
I know my aunt like that, she's got that. She doesn't really sleep, she'll sleep for 3 hours when she's up.
Which is okay. I mean, it's okay. You only need the sleep at the beginning of your sleep cycle is the most important sleep. So if you're only sleeping 3 hours a night, you're going through your delta wave sleep, and she's probably okay. But she's probably also aging a little bit faster than she should be, because she needs that other. It's all regenerative. I mean, you're trying to regenerate yourself. And this is one of the reasons why when people get older, they don't sleep as much as they did when they were younger. When you're younger, you sleep 7 or 8 hours, and that's perfect. Or 9 or 10 or 12 hours, whatever it is. But as you get older, you can't go to sleep as well at night when you go to bed, and then you're waking up earlier in the morning.
You have more responsibilities, so you're.
Well, there's a lot of things going on in your head. Or you have no responsibilities, you still can't sleep. And then you'll claim that you've got insomnia, which isn't true at all. You just have old fart sleep patterns that you need to get over. Okay. EEGs are used to map the brain functioning, of course. So we can look at abnormal functioning in the brain. We can also look at if an individual is in a coma, we can tell if there's any brain activity at all. 30 million people worldwide suffer from epilepsy. That's a lot of people. Epilepsy is characterized by seizures. Seizures are involuntary synchronized excitation of large groups of nerve cells in the brain. It's like electrical storm in your brain. Seizures can be triggered by trauma or injury to the brain. So if somebody has a TBI, a lot of times they will come out, they will develop epilepsy. They will develop a seizure pattern. Chemical changes derived from metabolic faults, exposure to toxins. This is, and you can read into their illicit drugs. Some of the drugs are very specific as to what they attack, and a lot of them attack your brain, and they will cause seizures in your brain. They will cause you to have seizures, and of course you think that you're getting high, so you're kind of stupid, and you just keep taking the drugs because that's what you're after that type of stimulation. But individuals can excite themselves into Parkinson's disease. They can do a lot of damage. Most of these drugs that we're talking about, methamphetamines, cocaine, the ones that excite the brain. They're causing overstimulation in the brain. And of course, we've seen this over and over again. One of the individuals that we know was a big-time cocaine user is Linda Ronstadt. She probably isn't doing it anymore. Well, she can't sing anymore. In her 60s, she developed Parkinson's disease. And it probably came from all that cocaine exposure. Sorry, Michael J. Fox, same situation. Too much cocaine, snorted too much cocaine. Robin Williams, of course, developed Alzheimer's disease, but these are all people's heroes, so it's really hard to talk about. Mutations in ion channels, of course, can also cause seizures. Parkinson's disease is a natural disease. A lot of people just develop Parkinson's disease. Is it coincidental that they used a lot of cocaine when they were younger? I have a friend that became a very important person he was a factory worker, and he became very important. He was the foreman, and then they moved him into management, and he started making lots and lots and lots and lots of money. And when he started making lots and lots and lots and lots of money, he did what rich people do, snorted cocaine. Yeah, in his 30s, he had a stroke. Yeah. Yeah. He's a mess right now. He's also a Republican. We won't go into that. That's what makes him a mess. Epilepsy is characterized by various types of seizures. Grand mal seizures are the most extreme form of epilepsy. Grand mal seizures are characterized by total muscle contraction followed by alternate jerking and relaxation. I don't know if you've ever seen anybody in a grand mal seizure. I had a friend when I was growing up who was epileptic, and he would have a grand mal seizure from time to time. His best friend knew how to handle things. Potentially, they say that you can swallow your tongue, but the reality is that when you're having a seizure, everything closes down, and they clamp down. I guess they could bite their tongue, but they clamp down really tight. And it's all the muscles in their head. So the tongue is a muscle, and it's paralyzed. The tongue is paralyzed, so they really can't swallow it. It's afterwards that things may happen. As soon as the seizure goes away, they start relaxing, and it's at that point that something odd may happen. And of course, they talk about biting your tongue off, and things like that. I had a patient when I was in the military. He was a Marine. No, he had been a Marine, and he was in an explosion, and it kicked him into epileptic fits. And he would have fits from time to time. He also lost part of his penis in the explosion. So they were afraid that he couldn't reproduce. We won't go into the rest of that. He was able to reproduce. That wasn't what happened. But he would have seizures, and he was like 250 pounds, 6'4". He was just a solid mass of muscle. When this guy had a seizure, he would destroy things. One time he was sitting on the toilet, and he had a seizure, and he broke the toilet off, and he punched a hole in the ceramic bathtub. Yeah, because his muscles just straightened out, and he had been sitting on the toilet. He kind of fell off the toilet, and he straightened up. When he did that, he busted the toilet off. And of course, water started spraying all over the place, and he punched a hole in the bathtub. And he was afraid that he would hurt somebody if he had a seizure around somebody, because they try to control him. And of course, he has no control over anything. He's afraid he would hurt his wife. And so that's how I got involved. Well, the way I got involved, I was a lab tech. We were trying to figure out his medication. You give people medication so that they don't have as many seizures. We were trying to figure out his medication. And he was about to get a divorce because he was afraid he'd hurt somebody, and he certainly didn't want to hurt his wife. Eventually, we kind of talked him into taking it easy. Maybe the medication's going to help. You can tell when you're going to have a seizure, and that's why he went into the bathroom. He went into the bathroom because he didn't feel good. So he started to have the aura. Do I talk about the aura in here anywhere? I think I do, somewhere. Anyway, they have an aura, and they start smelling rotten eggs and all kinds of stuff. And we just told him that if he felt that way, then he needed to go to a safe place, probably his bed, rather than the bathroom, which is a confined space. And the other problem was that a lot of times they will evacuate themselves, so they'll urinate. Sometimes they'll defecate when they have a seizure. Anyway, okay, so everything worked out fine. He did have a child. Everybody was happy. Grand mal seizure is characterized by muscle contraction, total muscle contraction. And of course, when you're 250 pounds, 6'4", muscle contractions are different from what smaller people. You'll jerk and then you'll relax. The seizure will last for 1 to 2 minutes. So you have these muscle contractions, and they're not breathing during these 1 to 2 minutes. But of course, you can hold your breath for 1 to 2 minutes. It rarely does that kind of damage. The recovery usually takes a couple hours, several hours, depending on whatever. So the grand mal seizure is one thing. They also have what they call petit mal. So if somebody is epileptic, a lot of times the grand mal seizures are fairly obvious, but the petit mal seizures are characterized by losses of consciousness for 5 to 15 minutes. And this are, 5 to 15 seconds, I'm sorry. But this is really kind of interesting. This is a reason that these guys can't drive. I mean, you don't want to have even a petit mal seizure. Well, if you had one of these kinds of seizures, you'd probably just wreck your car. But if you're not conscious for 5 to 15 seconds, you can't hit your brakes, that kind of stuff.
I think I've seen both sides of the grand mal and the petit mal. The petit mal is more likely to in a wave or something, but they're responsive and stuff, but it's just like they need a little bit of assistance, but
they can hear, but they can't respond.
Yes.
Can't react.
The grand mal, it's just like they're on a train or something, so you can see their eyes big and they just...
A lot of times they'll roll to the back of their head. But with the petite mal, it's just like all of a sudden they just go away. It's like they have a stroke or something. It's bizarre. But neither of these, so people with epilepsy can't drive, and that's logical. Even if they have to have not had an epileptic seizure in 2 years in order to get a driver's license. Complex partial seizures do not involve the entire brain. The individual may experience an aura, a perceived sensation that precedes the seizure. And as I said before, the aura usually is a smell. They can smell rotten eggs. They taste, the taste in their mouth becomes metallic. So it's like they're sucking on a penny or sucking on something metallic. Penny's copper, and it doesn't really taste like copper. It tastes like steel. Of course, we don't usually eat metal, so you guys don't have any clue what I'm talking about. It's really kind of bizarre. And it's not a pleasant taste. It's not a pleasant smell. It's not a pleasant taste. So usually when these things happen, of course, as you're walking along, if you suddenly smell rotten eggs, you assume that something's dead in the area. Okay. But these guys, of course, this odor will just come to them, and this taste will just come to them. But the reality is we experience all kinds of interesting things all the time anyway. The fob, the sixplex where my office is, I don't know what time it is doing. The water smells like sulfur, so it smells like rotten eggs. It's nasty. We've had people move out because the odor was so strong. I feel sorry for the people that have their offices right across from the bathrooms, because that odor is emanating from it. It's like somebody farted, on a continual basis. Somebody had a very extensive bowel movement, and the odor is stuck with people, or stuck with the bathroom. It's really kind of bad. But that's what is happening with these people. They're smelling really, really nasty smells. Rotten meat, some of them call it rotten meat, some of them call it, usually it's rotten eggs. It's just a sulfur smell. So you get a lot of, and usually they swear about it because it makes them sick, especially the Marine. You should hear some of the things he called it when he was, of course he had been in Vietnam, so, and those guys, they fertilize with human waste. Yeah, so as you're walking through the rice paddies, you know, the smell is beyond anything you can possibly imagine. So not only is it human waste, but it's rotting human waste. And of course, their diet is mostly rice and fish. So their waste smells good. Trying to make and I can't describe it, but he could. He's described it very well. Certain personality traits often accompany complex partial seizures, but it is not certain whether the traits trigger the seizures or the seizures trigger the traits. This guy, when he got mad, he would have a seizure. But he didn't get mad very often. Very even-tempered individual. He was so big that he could handle most things physically. And of course, he was a Marine, so he'd been trained not to react negatively to things. This is about the most even-tempered guy I had ever been around. And his wife just loved him, just thought the world of him. And of course, she stuck with him despite all of the other problems that he had. But if he ever got mad, he would have a seizure almost right away. So one of the things he did was control himself. His personality would change. You could tell it. I mean, you could see it. He had a seizure one time when he came in to the lab. And the reason he had the seizure was because they were giving him a new medication and he didn't know if it was going to work. And it was kind of an experimental medication, which now we're using all the time. But at the time, it was a brand new medication. He was a little upset. And of course, he was thinking about leaving his wife because, well, I told you why. He didn't think he could reproduce. This is what a grand mal seizure looks like. As you can see, you've got pink areas here. This is the area of electrical activity, extreme electrical activity. It's kind of like an electrical storm in the brain. And because of that, it shorts everything out. You can see how during the seizure, you've got the excessive activity. This is the individual recovering, and as you can see, there's still a ton of activity going on in the brain. So it kind of stimulates everything, and that's one of the problems. You have no control over it. Okay. That's
So when you say recovery, how can you tell it's recovering? I mean,
Well, he knows he's recovering because he's not.
I mean, that slide that we just.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, the slide that we just seen.
Yeah. How can you tell he was recovering?
Yeah.
Well, for one thing, it was right after the seizure.
And then is there a, like you see right there, to me it looks the same as the top one.
Well, we don't have this extreme.
Folded mark of the pink.
Yeah, the
area.
pink, the fuchsia. It's the fuchsia.
The fuchsia.
And you can see which area of the brain it's in. It's right over here.
Mhm.
Okay. And as you can see, it's no longer fuchsia. But the brain is still extremely, highly active. This electrical storm has caused the entire brain to be activated. And this is one of the reasons why you get so many, the taste, the smell. I mean, there are a lot of things going on in the brain. It's very painful. It's almost like getting electrical stimulation in the brain. Actually it is. And as you can see, recovery is relatively slow. What we're looking for is blue areas. We're looking for blue areas. The reason these areas are so blue is because they've been overstimulated, and now they're shutting down.
Okay.
But as he starts to recover, of course, the stimulation starts again, because they're shorted out. Okay. And here they're starting to come back. And as you can see, and then those areas start to go blue again because they shouldn't have been stimulated in the first place. But the blue areas become larger and larger. And that means the guy's going to be okay. But it takes hours for the brain to recover from this, all that overstimulation. You remember all the, it takes all this stimulation to get all these neurons to fire. But he's got his neurons firing, all of his neurons firing all at once. So you can imagine. Or she, I don't know if it's a male or female. As it turns out, most people with epilepsy are male. Can you think of any reason why that might be? What's wrong with males? That they would have more of a reaction than females? What's wrong with males? Or what's right with males? Why would they have more of a reaction than females would? Why are they more likely to have epilepsy than females? Remember, females have a larger corpus callosum. Females recover from a stroke more readily than males do because they can reroute. Their brain is more flexible. And because of that, the females don't, well, I don't know if it has to do with that specifically, but the female brain is a lot more flexible than the male brain. The male brain is far more hardwired. Which is a problem. Can be a problem. In this case, it's a really serious problem. Okay, we're going to talk about psychopharmacology. And of course, one of the reasons that this is such a fun class to teach is because we can talk about drugs and why drugs react, or why we react to the drugs that we react to. So this chapter is specifically about psychopharmacology. Most drugs affect the brain and behavior by changing synaptic transmissions. Axons release a chemical that either excites or inhibits the attached neuron. We learned that in the last chapter. This, of course, is a neurotransmitter, and it's or merely a transmitter, the chemical that we're talking about. The first transmitters to be discovered, and this is evolutionary. This is taking place over time. In the 1940s, we first realized that there were chemicals in the brain. Before, we thought it was all electrical impulses. We did EEGs. We electrically stimulated the brain and we got a reaction. But then in the 1940s, we actually discovered 3 neurotransmitters. And the first one that we discovered was acetylcholine. It was the first neurotransmitter that we discovered. And the reason we discovered it was because acetylcholine has to do with movement. And that's how we discovered it. But we also discovered norepinephrine and epinephrine, adrenaline and noradrenaline. We discovered that neurotransmitter at the same time. Before, we just thought they were hormones. But then we realized, wait a minute, we can find these in some of the synapses of the brain. And this is in the 1940s. Before we had the ability to break things down as well as we do today. Now, of course, with time, we discovered more and more of these things. Now, if you think about it, in the 1940s, we discovered acetylcholine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine, and we started developing drugs to control schizophrenia in the 1950s. Why? Well, because we had discovered these 3 drugs. We tried to find something that would either mimic it or it would block it. And that's what we did. And that happened in the 1950s. But during the 1950s, we also discovered the amino acid neurotransmitters, glutamate, glycine, and gamma-aminobutyric acid. All of these are inhibitory neurotransmitters. And these were discovered in the 1950s. So we started treating depression in the 1950s. We invented pharmaceuticals that actually worked on depression, and what we used was norepinephrine. We had tricyclics that affected the norepinephrine level, and that's what we were trying to control, was the norepinephrine level. We discovered it in the 1940s. In the 1950s, we tried to use it to treat schizophrenia, but it didn't work. But then we realized, wait a minute, all these guys that we're trying to treat for schizophrenia, their depression's going away if we give them this medication that we thought was going to work on schizophrenia. Their depression is going away. So we started treating depression with tricyclines. Isn't this exciting? And also monoamine oxidase inhibitors. Monoamine oxidase, we discovered the amino acid neurotransmitters. So all of a sudden, now we have 2 drugs to treat depression with. One of them increases the norepinephrine level, and the other one increases, the other one works on amino acids, the monoamine oxidase inhibitors. So now we have 2 drugs. Unfortunately, those 2 drugs aren't good for your liver. They also have side effects. If you take a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, you can't eat nuts, you can't eat olives, you can't eat pickles, and if you do, you may go into seizures and die. You can't drink red wine. So a lot of people were going, wait a minute, I'd rather be depressed and treat my depression with alcohol, by golly, or olives. Olives don't really work that well, but they didn't want to give up their olives or their cheese. They couldn't eat cheese either with that stuff. In the 1970s, investigators recognized the short-chain amino acids called peptides also served as transmitters of the endogenous opioids. This is when we realized that the opiates that people had been taking up to this point, morphine, heroin, all of these drugs, we understood how they worked. We also found oxytocin, which is kind of interesting. Substance P, which has to do with pain. And of course, almost all the drugs that we use for pain, ibuprofen, acetaminophen, all of these block substance P. And of course, these are drugs that we developed in the 1970s. And also vasopressin. Vasopressin has to do with urination, the accumulation of urine in your bladder. Vasopressin. I know, all of this is really exciting. How am I doing on time? 15, okay, I'm good. Transmitters must meet the following criteria. The chemical exists in the presynaptic terminal. The transmitter is manufactured in the neuron. The transmitter is released when the neuron fires. Specific receptors exist to receive the transmitter. Adequate amounts of transmitter will make the neuron fire. Blocking the transmitter stops activity. These are all what mark something as a neurotransmitter. So here we have, let's assume somebody is smoking marijuana. We had no idea what marijuana did. We had no idea what marijuana was doing to people's brains. We looked and we couldn't figure it out. It didn't make any sense. There were receptor sites that the marijuana was attaching itself to. But they weren't receptor sites that we didn't have a neurotransmitter to go with those receptor sites. It was almost like people had receptor sites in their brain for marijuana, but that didn't make any sense because marijuana it's a plant. It's a plant from China. So what the hell does that have to? Why in the world would the Europeans have a receptor site for a plant that grows in China? That doesn't make any sense. We needed to figure it out. And of course, until then, all the hippies and all the cool dudes, they were going, dude, yeah, it's a natural substance. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't do anything in your brain. I don't know what those munchies are all about, man. But wow, I smoke pot, and all of a sudden I feel mellow, and then I feel hungry, man, and so I get the munchies. And nobody could figure it out. And then in the 1990s, we finally figured it out. There was a neurotransmitter called anandamide. And the marijuana was attaching itself to the anandamide receptor site. So sometimes it takes time. And one of the reasons why we weren't even looking for anandamide was because we weren't doing any research with marijuana. But they were doing research with marijuana up in Canada. They were doing research with marijuana over in Europe. They were doing research with marijuana in Australia and New Zealand, where it was legal. And the reason it was legal was because they couldn't figure out what was going on, and they needed to figure it out because some people have a negative reaction to marijuana. They have an extreme reaction to marijuana. For the longest time, we didn't think that marijuana was addictive. Now, of course, we realize it is. For the longest time, we didn't think cocaine was addictive. And now we realize it is. So we had to figure all this stuff out. I mean, you can't make something illegal if you don't have any idea why it's doing something to the body. Why it's killing select individuals. And other people are having positive reactions to it. So we weren't doing anything in the United States, and we weren't doing any research. And since we weren't doing any research, we don't have the research to back up the idea that marijuana is destructive. And the reality is marijuana is probably destructive for, 5, 10, 15% of the people that smoke it. For the other 85%, it's not going to make any difference. It doesn't do anything to you. It makes you stupid for 3 weeks or 4 weeks. But other than that, it's not doing anything to 85% of the population. So do we make something illegal that is affecting 15% of the population? Do we make it illegal if it affects the immature brain? Kids under 12? Can we keep those guys from smoking marijuana? Or eating the edibles? And that's the question that we have to use right now. So one of the things we were looking for was what was going on here. The other thing is, do I have time to talk about Viagra? So we were trying to find, people have been looking for an aphrodisiac for like ever. Oh yeah, you eat oysters and if you're a male, then you can maintain your erection for an extended length of time. It makes you horny. We've been looking for that kind of stuff forever. Everybody has. Because as you get older, your testosterone goes down, naturally. And sometimes it goes down to the point that your libido goes away. So men have been trying to build up their libido for an extended length of time. So we were trying to find something that worked. And finally we did. We found something that worked. And now we know why it works. We know why Viagra works. And it's because of nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide is a neurotransmitter. It's the newest neurotransmitter that we have discovered in the brain is nitrous oxide. Isn't that exciting? And because of nitrous oxide, Viagra works. And now we know why Viagra works. And now we have an aphrodisiac. Now we have something for erectile dysfunction that we didn't have before. And it has become the most popular drug in the world. No. And it fits all these criteria. It's a chemical that we find in the presynaptic terminal. If we block it, then you can't have an erection. We can use it as a chemical castration, for chemical castration. I know. How exciting is that? So we'll pick this up next time.